But to the turmoil that's just hit the New South Wales coalition government just 6 months after it won the state election. Today, leadership challenge that went nowhere. Premier Gladys Berejiklian has mishandled a bill to decriminalise abortion. This bill actually allows the killing of babies just days from birth and also allows parents to abort a fetus for being of the so-called wrong sex, usually female. Now, it's a conscience vote, this bill, and 19 out of 33 Liberals in the lower house voted against it last month. But Labor had enough support to get it passed. Now it's in the upper house, and some Liberal MPs insist the government back some changes. And to get their way, 3 of them last night said they'd call for a leadership spill against Berejiklian. But they called it off this morning when one minister after another trashed them and backed the Premier. But this bill, nevertheless, has caused the biggest pro-life demonstrations in years. And it attracted speakers such as former Prime Minister Tony Abbott and former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce, who is still a Federal Nationals MP and joins me now. Barnaby Joyce, it's great to see you. Listen, did this supposed leadership challenge backfire, do you think, or did it achieve something?
No, I think it clearly spells out how important this is to the tens of thousands, I would say hundreds of thousands of people who've been taken completely and utterly by surprise because they were never given the dignity of a proper expression of their views by a parliamentary process that is supposed to do it. We have before us a bill in its current form which says that a baby born alive can be left to die. That in itself is animalistic. It's anathema to the way so many of us believe. It says that you can abort a baby or does not prescribe, that is, rule out, a baby that is born to be left to, if they're a girl, you can just kill them. Imagine in the future when you can determine the colour of their skin, whether it's too dark, too fair, not the right colour eyes, you can abort them as well. It also says that a doctor has no rights of conscientious objection. In fact, it takes them down the path of criminality if they dare to differ, if they dare to stand up for what they truly believe. It doesn't deal with consent, that if a girl who's been pressured by a boyfriend to have an abortion, it does nothing to stop that. It is in so many ways flawed, and I'll take you to another. It says 2 doctors after 22 weeks is all you need before you can abort a child to the day it would otherwise be born, viably born. Well, what 2 doctors, Andrew? What we are talking about a ear, nose and throat specialist and a dermatologist. They're doctors. It doesn't actually state which doctors. In its substance and its form, it is totally and utterly flawed. And no matter which way they believe, the upper house should reflect on how flawed this bill is. And if they let it go through in its current form, why are we paying them $200,000 a year at least each to not actually do their job? Now, I think what we have to acknowledge is not that these people stood up, but if that is their intent, their numbers clearly reflect the majority of what otherwise would be a good government. Why they decided to go into the parliament, having never told us this at the election, having never brought it up at a branch meeting, having never told us about a state conference, rather than fight to remove the regulations so we can build dams or fight for a better deal for drought, why they considered that the best form of concentration of their endeavours was to go into this social policy which has completely and utterly split the coalition, because there are many of us who this is the central part, or one of the central parts, the kernel of why we are in politics, the protection of the rights of the individual. And I believe that when a person could be viably born, they have every right to be protected. And the fact that we are now going down a path that not only will the state endorse for them to be killed, but will pay for it.
But Barnaby, here's the thing. What can the government actually do now? You're calling on it to act, but you're talking about the government interfering with a bill that's being decided on a conscience vote, not a party vote. Your quarrel is with the individual MPs, isn't it?
Well, I think that in so many of this, they have caucused, and they should reflect on the fact that the parliamentary process, which they are responsible for it, giving it time for it to be debated is a parliamentary process. So I don't give much credence to the fact that this is totally a conscience issue, because the process that surrounds it is certainly not a conscience issue. And for one, I absolutely know that they were planning this before the election, yet we never heard about it. And so it's incumbent upon them to accept that this is not a purely a conscience issue. It was designed and schemed and planned in such a way as to pull the wool over our eyes. And that is why so many people, even people in the pro-choice position, are furious. And I have the greatest retort to any of their arguments when they bring them up. I said, well, that would be an interesting thing to hear at an inquiry that we should have had, but we haven't had. And I'm not going to argue the case for the contrarian position that they have never allowed us to ventilate properly. And so I would say to the upper house members, most clearly, if you believe in the coalition's capacity to govern unquestioning to the end of its term, then you will do the right thing and pass the amendments. Remember, the amendments don't mean that we have prevailed, but it means that the highly obnoxious sections of this piece of absolutely flawed drafting in this legislation, pathetic, one of the worst drafted bills, can be knocked out or at least mitigated, mollified in such a way as it's partially acceptable.
But Barnaby, I noticed that you used in your first answer the word belief. That doesn't go with our beliefs. I know you're a Catholic. Here's the thing. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a Christian, right? And even I feel it's horrible. It's horrible to kill a baby that could be born 1 week later perfectly healthy. I find that awful, that idea. And I'm just wondering, why is it that you think, this goes beyond religion for me, why is it that you think so many MPs in Parliament and so many voters don't seem to care about this kind of thing?
Because it's tribalism of a certain view that goes beyond reason and goes beyond logic. They attach to a tribalism for what reasons I don't know. We have had hundreds of people protesting outside our branch meetings. We've never seen that before. Between 250 and 300 at Tamworth, about 150 at Gunnedah, protesting outside Nambucca Heads, branches saying that they're going to quit because they see it as basically the view of what other would be a party that believes in the right of the individual. This has got nothing. I don't say the word Christianity or God anywhere through my speeches because it's irrelevant, to be quite frank. This is about the right of an individual, and that us as a civilised nation, which doesn't need you to have a religion, says that an individual who could be born viably, who on a day could be born, quite obviously has rights. You don't need a religion to express that. It's self-evident by observation. And to say that a person, by an arbitrary point in time, which goes for about 20 weeks, 24 weeks that they can be survived in a neonatal unit, probably to about 20 to 42, 43 weeks that they can be born, and after that late-term birth, which would be induced. Now, are we saying this arbitrary point of time?
But also there was that other part, Barnaby. So late-term abortion, say it goes wrong, the baby's born alive. I just don't understand how any human being can contemplate, and we've actually seen it happen in hospitals, several cases I can point to, contemplate putting the baby on a shelf, or in one case in Darwin in one of those little tin pans, and leaving it to die. Leaving it to die. How does anyone do that? How does anyone contemplate walking past and letting that happen?
It is just barbaric. And when the amendment came up, Andrew, to stop that, we have so many of these people who you believe would... See, this says that they believe someone can die after they're born. And that is just why it's anathema. And this is why when an amendment came up to outlaw that, they voted against it. I mean, this is the sort of ultimate tribalism of a ridiculous sort of nihilistic view on human life. And it's so absurd. If they sat back and thought about it, do they realise what they are doing? There is no philosophy in this, because that argument has been won. This is purely political. And I could say to people, don't think for 1 second if someone stole your car that you'd forget about it in 3 years' time. Well, this is about you killing a person and thinking that in 3 years' time they're going to forget about it. They're not.
Barnaby, I was going to ask you all about the political machinations and whether Gladys Berejiklian is going to survive with all that. But also, really, you know, in the great scheme of things, those things, political questions, are so small when you look at the magnitude of the moral question that faces us. And I'd like people to actually leave aside their politics, leave aside their religious views or non-religious views, and just think, do you really want people who have just delivered a child to leave it to cry itself to death? It's happened in Darwin. The coroner there was shocked. It's happened in Melbourne. It's happened in New South Wales. And this legislation says that's perfectly fine. Barnaby Joyce, I thank you for speaking up.
Always a pleasure. It's essential.